I would like to explain to you who are with us as keynote speakers. But before I will name them one by one. I will just briefly go into the topic just transition. Why are we looking at it from this angle? As you know, that the global energy transition gave an exponential rise to the alternative energy sources. It means that there is a change in landscape in sourcing from the old traditional ones to new ones. And that has a lot of effects. Effects not only for us in the supply chains, how we have to organize it, but it is here and there, upstream and downstream. And we are very much considered about how this happens. We want it to be just and fair here and there. And today, we would like to bring various multi-sectoral approaches to present them to you and see what they take and how they can help to make the transition just. So I like to present to you our panelists. We have René van Hel, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Netherlands. Anouk van Es, Policy Officer of the Socio-Economic Council and Secretariat of the Metal Agreement. Maria Paula Quinzeno, CNV International from Colombia. Giannina Echevarria, also CNV International, joining from Peru. Pim Bergkamp, Senior Category Manager, Tata Steel, IJmuiden. Diana Quiroz, Researcher Profundo. Barbara Kuiper, I don't know the name, sorry. Barbara, you will correct me. You are also from Profundo. And Mark van der Waal from IUCN. Thank you for being with us, panelists, and let us look at the program for today in brief before we take off with our first presenter. Okay, as you see, we have about 4 sessions. The first 3 are the presentations, and the last one is a panel discussion, the way forward. So the first 3 will look at the different multi-sector approaches. One is on the transition and the international responsible business conduct introduced by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The second one is how does the Metal Agreement implement a joint due diligence approach? And the Secretariat from the Metals Agreement will explain and demonstrate how the tools are developed and how they work. Then we will have a Spanish presentation that will go on participatory monitoring tool on the ground upstream. And the third one on section 2 is a presentation by Tata Steel on how they use the stakeholder approach and the tools that have been developed. Then the third session, we go more to dig deeper in the impacts of the energy transition in the supply chains. First, we go to the Latin America Profundo research. And after that, we go to the transition in sourcing with the environmental focus. And this will be done by IUCN. And then we proceed to the panel discussion. So thank you for being with us. Use the chat box for your questions. And I hope you can together find answers to all that we need to do. And let's go ahead with the first presentation. René van Hel is working for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Before he was Ambassador on Sustainable Development. Currently, he's Director Inclusive Green Growth. Welcome, René, for being with us. And I would like to give you the floor to give us an introduction on the principles of multi-stakeholder action to make the metal sector more sustainable and support a just transition from a government perspective. René, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much, and welcome, dear participants, and also glad to see some familiar faces in the list of attendees. Great that we're all joining worldwide this OECD partner session today. It's for many reasons that I'd like to welcome CMV's International's involvement in this event, not in the least as I was a member myself of a trade union ever since I started working. Today, we reflect on the need, firstly, the need for a just transition, secondly, responsible business conduct as an enabler, and thirdly, perhaps most importantly, the need to work together, all of us, to make this happen. We all have a role to play. In the recent IPCC report launched earlier this month, scientists say it's now or never to limit global warming. The window of opportunity is to ensure a livable future for all is rapidly closing. The importance to act now is clear. So with the global energy transition and its exponential rise in demand for alternative energy sources, coal mines are being shut down globally and value change are shifting to the mining of metals and critical materials and minerals. Production of graphite, lithium, and cobalt, they will, in this context of this transition that we're seeking, to be significantly ramped up by more than 450% by 2050 compared to 2018 levels to meet demand from energy storage technologies. Upscaling of critical raw material sites and opening new mines are, of course, time-consuming and capital-intensive processes. Opening a new mine takes around 10 to 12 years due to exploration and permits processes and construction works. So as a result, it's a big challenge to produce sufficient amounts of critical raw materials needed for technologies that support energy transition and climate policy goals. And this increase in demand and shift away from fossil-based systems and towards certain critical materials drastically changes the landscape of sourcing countries and overall can have negative consequences on national income, livelihoods, and the environment if we do not manage this properly. We all agree, or I hope we all agree, that the energy transition is crucial, but what does it mean for the people and communities that rely on fossil-based systems of energy production and consumption, or for the environment in countries rich in critical materials? We strongly believe that if we want to meet the challenge of decarbonizing our economies in a sustainable manner, we need to work on a just transition. We need to ensure that the process towards an environmentally sustainable economy is well managed and contributes to the goals of social inclusion and the eradication of poverty. And we also recognize that the transition is not just the replacement of one industry with another, but hopefully also a diversification towards a more sustainable, resilient, and inclusive society overall. That's not going to be easy because it really calls for us to recognize our role in working that no one is left behind in a transition and that all countries in the end must benefit from the opportunities offered by sustainable and just transitions and by this new economy that societies that we're working on. So stakeholders need to adopt a careful approach to their due diligence practices, especially I would say also in regard to the local communities and mine workers at the beginning of the value chain. These are people, these are the ones who are often overlooked in energy transition plans. You may have heard of the Just Transition Declaration. It's a declaration that was signed by 14 countries, the Netherlands included, during the UN Climate Conference in Glasgow last November. And what is nice about this declaration is that it has some very practical principles. One of the principles focuses on supply chains. So what does it say? It says that the transition impacts businesses in supply chains and the health, environmental, and broader social and economic interest of those economically reliant on those supply chains. The signatories, and that's important, aim to ensure that existing supply chains and the new supply chains required for the energy transition create decent work for all, including for the most marginalized, and create equitable employment across borders. Working on these principles, we, the Netherlands government, urge our businesses to ensure that supply chains are free of environmental and human rights abuses. And of course, we do that on the basis of the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, and of course, also the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And I'd like to say that, and I also worked on those issues for a long time, that ever since the adoption of the OECD guidelines and the UNGPs, significant steps have been taken to foster business respect for people and planet in their value chain. My country has tried and worked consistently to be at the forefront of these developments. And we were also one of the first countries in the world to adopt a national action plan on business and human rights and an ambitious policy on responsible business conduct. At the same time, I also realized when I say that we also have a responsibility because our footprint worldwide is not only green and social. Having said that, more needs to be done to advance a just transition and make responsible business conduct the norm. We started to implement in the Netherlands a mix of hopefully mutually reinforcing measures to promote RBC. And it varies from imposing due diligence legislation to stimulating RBC through support measures, financial incentives, and of course, conditional public support. What we do this afternoon is really important. We focus on an interesting example of a multi-stakeholder approach, the International RBC Agreement for the Metal Sector. Netherlands companies in the metal sector often rely, or let's say, I can also say in general, our companies in the metal sector often rely on the import of raw materials for their production. And the sector in itself, of course, runs an increased risk, I would say, of being witness or indirectly or directly violating human rights, labor rights, and environmental and biodiversity standards, and of having, of course, an impact on local communities. On a positive note, that I also like to stress, the mining sector can also, of course, be an important source of livelihood and employment. So what do the Dutch sector agreements do? They try to promote international RBC by creating partnerships between businesses, trade associations, government, unions, and NGOs. So this multi-stakeholder collaboration aims at identifying and preventing preventing abuses of human rights and environmental standards in supply chains. The agreements are concluded sector by sector because we don't only have them in the metal sector. And we really try to have a long-term strategies to tackle complex problems and issues together. Two goals, of course, to improve circumstances in a number of risk areas like child labor, low wages, human rights violations, and environmental pollution, and really try to have concrete results within a period of 3 to 5 years after the agreement was signed in 2019, and to offer a collective solution to problems that businesses are unable to solve on their own. So the Dutch metal sector also works with, of course, with recycled metal, and using responsibly recycled scraps helps to reduce the demand for primary raw materials and contributes also to a circular economy. So really aiming a lot of positive things, hopefully, with the thing, and not only aiming, but also achieving on those things. We see the agreement as an instrument for companies and other stakeholders, ourselves, to improve the collective performance. And as a result, from the cooperation between parties, we see results. And later on this afternoon, we will also discuss the projects in South America that will be discussed later on. What I think what the agreement also has done is that it has helped the metal sector to comply with the so-called EU conflict minerals regulation that entered into force in 2021. And you're aware probably that this regulation obliges importers of 4 specific metals to investigate the source of their raw materials. And compliance with these international guidelines probably, hopefully, of course, supports also the progress towards the SDGs. Going back to the Just Transition Declaration, I think it clearly recognizes the need to ensure that no one is left behind in the transition to net zero economies, particularly those working in sectors, cities, and regions reliant on carbon-intensive industries and production. So today, we are proud to present learnings from this multi-stakeholder initiative in the metal sector in support of a just transition. So thank you for your attention. I know that I will get a question, so I now wrap up so that there's time for this question that I will get. But thank you for your attention.
Thank you, René, for your presentation. And indeed, you mentioned a lot of things that need to be done by many parties in a holistic way to reduce the risk and to work towards the energy transition by reducing the amount that we use and reuse, how we should do it. I would like to ask you specifically, can you name something what governments, not just a Dutch government, what governments should specifically do to make sure that the energy transition in Europe leads towards a just transition in the carbon and metals international supply chain?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think first and foremost, we should make sure that we don't become hostage of politicians. And of course, politician Trump is a great example in this context, because with his someone is asking the floor.
Excuse me?
All right, I will continue.
Oh yeah, just finish your sentence.
I think we should be really careful that we will not be hostage of politicians who, with fake news and let's say non-existing promises, like politician Trump did, undermine the transition that we're looking for. And so we should also be honest about the transitions, and we should also recognize that it affects the livelihood of people. And what can we do? So what we can do is to support workers in the transition to new jobs and really promote green and inclusive jobs. How do you do that? Well, of course, by supporting skill development and favorable labor policies. So that is important. Skills, education, capabilities, capacities. It's also very important to have an honest social dialogue and to have social stakeholder engagement. And moreover, I think that we should also support countries in creating and enabling environments and frameworks, and really come up with long-term economic strategies to ensure this sustainable, durable, and inclusive economic recovery and growth.
Okay, so being long-term and communicate transparently, maybe that will help.
But okay. I think I spoke in a very theoretical and a technical way, perhaps a little bit, but I really like to warn that what is the biggest risk is that all our good intentions are derailed by politicians.
Okay,
with fake news.
I've taken your point. We take it off to the panelists. I think we should now go on to the next one, but we've taken your point. Thank you, René.
You're welcome.
So we can now go to the next presentation. We have 3 more on the multi-sectoral approach. And the first one will be by Anouk, who will demonstrate the online due diligence portal. The portal includes several due diligence tools for middle and downstream users in the metals value chain, such as the maturity assessment tool, the individual and collective heat maps, due diligence policy formats. All these tools have been developed to support the companies to implement the OECD guidelines, step 1 to 6. Anouk, I will give you the floor.
Yes, Pauline, thank you very much. And thank you all for being present and for your interest in this session. Before I dive into the tool, I would like briefly to introduce the Social and Economic Council and how we are involved in the Metals Agreement. And afterwards, I will give you a brief digital tour through our web tool for due diligence, which we offer to the companies, member companies of the Metals Agreement, that supports them to implement due diligence in line with the OECD guidelines and the United Nations guiding principles. So let me share my screen. The Social and Economic Council, or in short, the SER, that is an independent advisory body for the Dutch government. As you can see on the picture on the right, that is the council itself. So the council consists of employers and workers representatives and of independent experts that are academics. So this council provides input for the SER advices to the government on the social and economic policy. Next to the council, the SER is also engaged in other activities, among which the facilitation of different multi-stakeholder agreements. And some of these agreements are agreements on international responsible business conduct. So on this slide, you can see all the Irbc agreements that the SER facilitates. But for today, we dive into the due diligence tool of the metals agreement. So my colleagues and I from the SER also form the independent secretariat of this agreement. And before I start the digital tour in the web tool, I would briefly like to introduce some basic principles where the tool is built upon. So The starting point for the metals agreements in general are the OECD due diligence guidelines and the United Nations guiding principles. In the web tool, we also use the 6-step due diligence framework approach of the OECD as a starting point to create the different tools and templates or the elements in the portal, as you will see in a few minutes. So what we basically did is that we captured most of these steps. I think for most of you, they are familiar, but just to show you the link between our portal and the due diligence steps is that we take the companies through step 1 to 5 in different elements. So we start with a self-assessment questionnaire that is mainly focused on internal due diligence processes and their policy. Step 1, then we continue with step 2, which is the mapping of the supply chain and risk identification and prioritization of risks, followed by the development and implementation of a due diligence action plan. The Secretariat also involved in the monitoring of the individual companies, which is part of step 4. And last but not least, we also offered a reporting template to assist companies on their external communication about due diligence. So I will now share the due diligence portal with you, and I'll briefly go through it, some different elements. So companies that will log in will get their own secured environment where they can provide answers, but also can collect due diligence information for their company. This is very secure portal, so only the companies themselves will get access to their environment and the independent secretariat, because we can assess and monitor the company's progress, and we can also provide feedback in this tool to share with the companies in order to improve their due diligence processes or make them more in line with the international guidelines. So as an example, as a company, you will log in and you will see your personalized dashboard. This dashboard consists of an overview of the progress of your due diligence implementation. It will say which elements are complete and which are still open, and it will also say what next action is expected from your company. So this will be a general overview of your due diligence implementation. Companies will get to fill in this tool every year, so that this also enables us as a secretariat to monitor companies' progress over the years. For today, I would like to highlight 3 elements of the tool. So first, the maturity assessment part. This is a self-assessment questionnaire for the companies to complete and covers all the due diligence steps. Secondly, the risk analysis section. So this section helps companies to map their supply chain and to do their risk analysis and prioritization of risks. And lastly, the action plan template, which helps companies to start with their due diligence action plan in order to improve and enhance their due diligence processes internally, but also in their supply chain. So first of all, companies will start with filling in this assessment each year. First year is a baseline assessment. So this questionnaire will start with a company profile, and this is done, it asks questions like what materials do you use and what is your position in the supply chain. This enables the rest of the questionnaire to be more tailor-made towards the context of that company. And it will cover the 6 different due diligence steps as described by the OECD guidelines. So by answering all these questions, the company will get an idea what is expected from it by the OECD guidelines. By completing all the questions, it will also get assigned a maturity level. Based on that, the company can see what the status is of due diligence implementation. And by filling in it every year, it can also see the progress it makes. So our aim is to support companies that are member for the agreement to reach full maturity within 5 years. As an example, I will show one of the questions. So companies can answer the question, provide an explanation, and also attach evidence to support their answer. So this way, the tool also helps companies to create one spot overview of all their due diligence documentation. And that could, for example, be useful for audits. After the maturity assessment, the next step will be the risk analysis. So this is the second due diligence step if you look at the due diligence cycle. The risk analysis section consists actually of two parts. The first part is a supply chain mapping exercise. So we ask companies to insert the materials that they work with. So you see some examples here. And for each material, we ask them to fill in which production locations are present for that material in this supply chain. So for example, for aluminium, there are some different production locations and some other geographical details, and also which production processes do take place at that stage of the supply chain. So with this information, the materials combined with the countries or the production locations, we ask the companies to add international Irbc risks or due diligence risks. So that are risks for human rights, labor rights, or the environment. And we also ask the companies to scale them based on severity and likelihood. So the scaling of severity and likelihood, that can be based on reports, databases, but also by consulting other agreement participants like NGOs or trade unions. So after the risk analysis, this will result in a heat map for the individual companies. This is an example. And in this heat map, you will have in one overview all your most salient risks. So in this case, in the red area, you see an example. If you click on it, you see the deforestation in aluminium sourcing in Peru. It's just a fictional example, but to show you how the tool works. In one overview and prioritization of the most salient risks. Last but not least, companies will get access to a tailor-made action plan. So you can download the action plan on this page. The action plan will contain information on the maturity assessment results, so the answers provided. Based on that, it will give tailor-made example actions that the company can take to improve its internal due diligence processes, and it will also contain a list of the most salient risks in the heat map. And furthermore, it provides guidance for companies to write their actions in a smart way, so specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound.
Anouk.
These are some examples of the tool.
Anouk, can you hear me?
Yes.
Because we are getting to the time that you have to finish your presentation. It's very interesting. Perhaps you can round it off by, in a general sentence on whether it works, whether businesses have appreciated your tool so far. And perhaps you can say what is the role of the civil society within this tool and within this exercise? Yeah.
Yes, that's a good question, actually. So for the companies, we see they already make a lot of use of the tool. It is user-friendly, and we hear a lot of positive response on the use of the tool. Of course, as you mentioned, not only companies are part of the agreement, also civil society organizations, NGOs, trade unions, and their role in the agreement is very important as well. As there's close collaboration in the multi-stakeholder agreement, and civil society organizations are important in the entire due diligence process of companies. They can be consulted, they have a lot of expertise and experience on their subject fields, but they also have networks on the ground. So in that sense, they're also very important when companies would like to initiate a collective project on the ground. Yeah, that are some
very good thing, because I think that is a very nice bridge to our next presentation, because our next presentation that shows how we work in the sector agreements on metals is from the first collective project that the metals agreement has developed with CNV, the trade union international, and we have set up collective research and monitoring of the risks in occupational health and safety. And I would like to give the word to Maria Paulo first, and then after her, Giannina will share more information about the collection of data and interviews and the monitoring tool in general. Go ahead, Maria Paula. And those who want to listen in English, please use the interpretation button.
Gracias, soy María Paula y les presentaré.
Thank you very much. I'm Maria Paula, and I'll present the focus of this participative study. So this is a recent monitoring instrument that we have developed. It is used by the workers, and we know that this is crucial information. This is particularly so, and it's very useful for the companies as well. It's a participative monitoring system, and it is increasing the transparency of the due diligence. So we are monitoring, and in this way, we can contrast actually the standard information that is provided by the employers. So we can actually study other elements as well throughout the mining chain. So the participative monitoring is enabling us to listen to the input of the workers. And so we work with the information that is provided by the workers. And this information that is shared with us is actually a reflection of their working conditions. And empowerment is a very important element as well of this monitoring activities. There are many people who are participating, and they have their own information that they share. It's very important.
Tiene también este método de monitoreo efectos.
Another element are the effects. We have accurate data and verified data.
Podemos tomar decisiones estratégicas, no solamente dentro de las empresas y de los sindicatos, sino también con otras organizaciones. Es una metodología abierta a la participación. Nosotros desconocemos la totalidad de trabajadores, principalmente los no sindicalizados o trabajadores indirectos. Y a través de los grupos de líderes podemos ir llegando a estas poblaciones. La validez estadística de nuestros datos se obtiene en la medida que crece la participación de los trabajadores en el proceso de monitoreo. El proceso de monitoreo se basa en una decisión voluntaria para la participación y llegamos a través de este método a lo que se conoce como poblaciones desconocidas u ocultas y poblaciones que se encuentran altamente dispersas. Es un método anónimo por seguridad y para mantener la confianza de trabajo con los trabajadores con quienes venimos desarrollando esta metodología. Sus opiniones son veraces y llegamos a acuerdos de divulgación discutidos con ellos mismos. El método se conoce como muestreo dirigido por participantes. Es ampliamente usado y se combina con el esquema de muestreo de bola de nieve. Es decir, nuestro trabajo entra e inicia por los líderes y los sindicatos, y estos a su vez se comunican con otros líderes y otros trabajadores para que participen del proceso de monitoreo. Es lo que se conoce como poblaciones ocultas y nosotros llegamos a través de bola de nieve a ellos. Utilizamos para ello la plataforma.
So therefore, we use the toolbox, and this is a very important element. And it is providing good and solid and swift results. And in this way, we can learn a lot, actually, about the conditions of the workers. First of all, and the most important, is that we're able to establish an impact and a participation of the participants. And furthermore, we can reach an agreement on disclosure. We have delicate information as well, and it is complex, and sometimes we have to add some answers. But it's very important that we carry on doing and performing this process in order to have a significant impact and to gather significant data. So this is all actually leading to a multi-annual analysis. And in this way, we are able to contrast our results with the results of other methodologies. So this is a monitoring system, and it shall be transferred to the unions and to the other organizations in order to have a proper appropriation and in order to provide them with their own input. Thank you very much.
Very
so
nice.
The results that I'd like to present are a reflection of the different working conditions.
Okay.
Can I continue?
Yes, I would like to know that Maria will tell when Janina takes over to give her part, because I'm not sure.
She is already in here. So Janina is speaking now.
Okay, thank you.
Janina continúa ya.
Janina is already, she has taken the floor already. Okay, thank you very much. The results, as Maria said, are actually an indicator of the different working conditions that we have been informed about by the workers in Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. So in 13 companies. In the digital monitoring, 13 workers, 13 companies have participated, 3 in Colombia, 5 in Peru, and 5 in Bolivia. The majority are males workers, and mainly in Peru and Bolivia. In the Peruvian questionnaire, both direct and indirect workers have participated. Okay, the presence of a collective bargaining agreement is not always there, and by some of the workers, it is perceived, 67% of the workers thinks that the collective labor agreement is not complied with. And this is an overview, actually, of the effect on the workers that are involved in the extraction industry. And a number of legal proceedings have been started by the unions, for example, in Peru. This has been reported, and in Bolivia as well, a huge number. And then information about dismissals and forced retirements due to COVID-19. The workers have reported that they are aware of cases that have taken place. And then if we take a look at occupational health and safety, then they report that they have information of occupational accidents and diseases as a result of their work. Mortal accidents or lighter incidents, but as well accidents that are leading to disability. The extension of working hours, then many workers reported as well, 7 working days and 3 days of rest. And this is a situation that is especially frequent in Colombia, because they are not only working 7 days continuously, and then they work shifts of 12 hours a day. And this means that before they worked 15 days a month, now they're working 21 days. And moreover, there has been dismissal of 25% of the working force. If we then check out the good practices for the subcontractors, then there's a huge number of workers who do not have proper labor conditions. Then closure plans in Colombia. Well, some workers are aware that these exist, but a huge number of participating workers in the monitoring instrument indicate that it has not been executed, this plan. So the digital monitoring makes it possible to reach out to all end users and the unions. So once a person has obtained the form, then this person is able to fill it out on the internet. So the respondents report the existence of collective bargaining agreements, but there is a high rate of non-compliance. Many workers report that their union rights are not respected. Many respondents have mentioned as well incidents regarding anti-union acts, especially in Colombia, dismissals for the union leaders. That's quite common. Furthermore, there are accidents, occupational accidents and diseases. And of course, it was mentioned as well by the respondents that there is no proper practice concerning the health conditions on the work floor. In Colombia, there are closing plants, but these are unknown to the workers. And we have drawn the conclusion as well that the indicators and method can be used by civil society, trade unions, students, companies as an input for research, evaluation, or risk assessment. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this insightful monitoring assessments in Peru and Colombia. And I would like to ask you, because in the last slide you said, what we can do with it. And I'm wondering whether this monitoring, this participatory monitoring tool, how it differs to the current traditional due diligence, which does not have the input from the workers. How can we make sure that this monitoring tool can be integrated in the formal due diligence? Because how do you see that? Can I ask Giannina?
Sí, a diferencia de otros métodos.
Well, actually, difference with the other methodology. In this case, the miners are part of it. And it's also for the direct and indirect workers, and they're suffering from the poor practices. In this way, we can do diagnosis and analysis and an auto-evaluation. So it's a new experience, and it's an acknowledgement of the workers that actually are at the basis of the mining chain.
Good. Indeed, it is very helpful, and we hope that ultimately those monitoring tools will be part and parcel upstream and downstream in the due diligence, that they will be integrated. Thank you very much for your presentation. Then we will go over to the next presentation. This is the third one as part of the multi-stakeholder demonstration of what we do in the agreement. And this is from Tata Steel IJmuiden, where Pim Bergkamp will show us and will share us a first-hand experience on how they use the different due diligence tools for their own risk assessments and present a case study on some findings and results. Pim, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Pauline. We're very happy to be part of this conference. Together with Chantal Dekker, who is in the sustainability procurement team, I will do this presentation. And I hope it will be a practical one for everybody who's listening. I will share my screen now. Can you see this?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Okay.
Here we are.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, so this is the first slide, and one of our internal slogans is together we make the difference. And this applies, of course, for Tata Steel as a steel company, but it also applies for all participants in the supply chain who finally produce, mine, produce, refine, and deliver to our end customers. And the only thing to do this in a sustainable way, I think, is to do this together. So it's a very common and useful statement to use. In my presentation, I will start with the sustainability, the Tata Steel Netherlands priorities and how they are linked to the SDG 17. Then we step over to the first actions we took on a heat map in 2016, which ended up in 2019 after many working together with the SER in signing the metal convenant, the Irbc metal agreement, and we work on that. And since 2021, we are designing a standardized way of working to generate the heat map and to work and to learn also from the due diligence process. And in 2020, July, we will start the first collective action planned in Manganese. And Chantal will elaborate on that. If I go to the short introduction of Tata Steel in the Netherlands, we're part of the Tata Steel Group, one of the world's most geographically diversified steel producers. In IJmuiden, the Netherlands, we have 9,000 employees, 250 researchers. We have a capacity of 7.5 million tons of steel. And we are a fully integrated steel plant. So we start with iron ore and coal and transfer that via sinter pellet and coke plants, blast furnace, and two rolling mill sections, hot dip galvanized and painted. And we supply to the automotive, construction, packaging, and engineering markets. We also have a long tradition of innovation and continuous improvement. And an example of that is the energy reduction since 1990, which took 31% reduction. And we're producing even better and better capable high strength steels now, lighter and stronger and of higher quality. As an example, car building industry and building industry and packaging. And in terms of our surroundings, we take a lot of initiatives to do good for our environment, to invest in this. Recently, we announced the start of a 300 million dusting plant for the pelletizing, which reduced 80% of the emissions. And in sustainability is in our heart, also in our management team. And we're dedicated to both managing our operation responsibly and in a continuous improvement process. We started working, as I said, with the SER since 2016. So this is the slide in very short, how the 17 SDGs, where we took a number of for our internal plan for sustainability, being a good employer for our environment and communities, for decarbonization and our customer and profitability. And for decarbonization, you might all be aware that we started the roadmap and the investments to build, to rebuild and redesign our plant into a hydrogen energetic plant. So that will diminish our coke plants, sinter plant and pellet plants, the most polluting plants in our steel plant. And that's a very, very innovative plan we're working on. If we go to 2016, when we engaged with the SER already, we were asked to fill in, to provide a heat map in terms of severity and likelihood on a number of categories and materials we buy. We did this only purely on the knowledge which was in our category teams on their materials and on their supplier knowledge. But this is not a way we do it now, because you never know where it ends up, and up till the mining company. You deal with suppliers and you're not able to track all parts in the supply chain. So in 2019, we signed the Irbc metal agreement, and this provided us a huge framework in terms of the maturity assessment, with over 200 questions, which also gave us good guidance on all the areas we had to work on in terms of sustainability, in terms of governance, in terms of your dashboard for your management, about awareness in the company to work all in the same way on sustainability. And then we started also with the heat map. And the heat map is an interesting thing, because if we as a company buy over 30,000 materials, how on earth can you map for all those materials the supply chain? Because you always end up somewhere in a mine. But what are the fields you have to focus on? And what are the risks associated with the countries where you source your material from? How do you get that knowledge? So we linked in with Maplecroft, a global risk intelligence company, and they provided data for sustainability, resilience, and ESG issues. So from the over 160 ESG risk indices, we took on the areas of human rights development, environment, politics, and economics and finance, 32 indices, which were linked to countries, and where we saw some indicators were red or green, and we had to focus on. So this was a very transparent and professional way to get information from supply chains and countries around the world. And then we started to standardize our risk analysis in terms of a heat map. And being very practical, if you have an SAP or an ERP system, you have all your data in terms of suppliers, materials, but you do not have your locations where products are manufactured. Because if you have a company, your address in SAP will be the headquarters somewhere in London. But what's interesting in mapping the supply chain is where the production locations are, and where the transfer of material is, where there's refinery, where's mining, etc. So the first step, and that's a tip for all, make a selection of those categories which are intuitively and by knowledge linked most directly to mining activity. So we chose alloys, for example, aluminum diox, metals, minerals and fluxes, refractories, roll, scrap, iron ore and coal, of course, and cobalt and copper. And for those materials linked to those categories, which were about 2,000, we wrote a letter to all our suppliers to give their supply chain in terms of countries where they source. So from that point, we could build on supplier information the supply chain. So we had Maplecroft knowledge about the countries, and we also asked our procurement team, do you have in these categories of products we produce an idea of emissions, about risks in that product range? So we had also internal knowledge about the products. And via this flow diagram, we merged all the data to finally come up with a heat map. And the output from input to output is, of course, based on the heat map to go to mitigate the adverse impact on society, on countries, on people, and to have mitigating actions on this. And this is shown on this chart. And to ensure that we prevent and mitigate adverse impact, we always need to engage with suppliers, because the easy step would be kick out the suppliers who are polluting, and then you're safe. But that's not the way we have to do it. We always have to find a dialogue with our suppliers and together come to an action plan to improve and to understand what their point of view on sustainability is. So
thank you, Pim.
Yes.
I think that, can you round it off in 30 seconds? Because I think otherwise we are in short of time, and your colleague Chantal also would like to say something.
Yeah,
I think it was a very good thing that you said that you need the dialogue and not to abort, you know, the connection between suppliers. Would you like to say one more sentence to end your presentation before we move on to your colleague Chantal?
Yes, please. And this is a very simple diagram. So the outcome of the heat map should be prioritized based on an analysis. And then you go into the diligence process. That's also based on the OECD guidelines. So you do a pre-assessment, due diligence via a supplier visit or a collective action. And that's a key thing in bringing parties together in the supply chain. And the outcome would be, after this assessment, decide to phase out suppliers, or to have a continuous program to improve, to address adverse impact and to improve it. So I would like to end this off and go to Chantal.
Yes, I will elaborate very quickly, if that's still possible.
Yeah, because you have only 2 minutes to help us out and give us your main view.
Of course, okay. Well, one of the risks in our heat map in our supply chain is manganese. And that's why we took action upon that. Via the SARE, we are brought to the attention of the Manganese Method Report of Action 8. This report is about the negative consequences of manganese mining in South Africa. So we basically took 2 actions. First of all, we started the conversations with all of our ferromanganese suppliers. As you can see in the supply chain, we are not directly linked to the mining companies, but there's a production company in between. We showed them the report and started a conversation, and also asked them about how much of their manganese ores come from South Africa. Of course, we also requested them to reach out to the mining companies directly. And secondly, we started a collective action, and we spoke to many companies and NGOs. But most importantly, one of our producers is willing to cooperate with us. And that's why we will start a mission to South Africa to visit the mining companies. And for us, it has a dual purpose. First of all, of course, we want to check upon the report and analyze the local situation. Our aim is to set up an action plan together with our producer and the mining companies in order to improve the local situation. But also internally, we would like to set up a format, and that is why we hired an experienced consultant in order to use for this due diligence, but also for future due diligence and other risks in our supply chain. Thanks. This is really quickly.
Yeah, you did it very well, and in a nutshell, but it was very clear. And it is very good that you know, your risk assessments has led, and together with the report for Action 8, to actually take action. And I think that based on the previous speakers in Colombia and Peru on the monitoring tool, it may also be interesting for you to see how you can rope such an on-the-ground monitoring tool from workers. Yeah. That would be very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
I will leave it here, and then we proceed to the last section of our presentations. And this is unforeseen impacts of the global energy transition. And we will have 2 presentations. One is from Profundo, and CNV, so the Trade Union International, foresees that the energy transition will impact the mining industry in all kinds of ways. And therefore, they asked Profundo to investigate how supply chains in carbon and metals needed for the transition actually work to be able to foresee the major risks. So I give the floor I think I will give the floor first to Barbara.
Yes, I'm starting. Thank you.
And you have some time to explain. You have 9 minutes.
Well, I'll try to keep it short, my part, as some of the things have already been mentioned by previous speakers. Yeah, we have been commissioned by CNV to conduct a study on risks in mining supply chains. We're looking at coal from Colombia, as well as several of the minerals that are important in the energy transition that come from Peru and Bolivia. We're looking at main actors, especially the EU supply chain and the involvement of European financial institutions in financing these actors. We're looking at the impact of human rights due diligence policies and practices on labor rights, and at market trends more broadly that are linked to the energy transition. This whole study is still work in progress, but yeah, we'll briefly presenting some first outcomes. I'll be very quick on this. This has been mentioned before, that the energy transition is obviously connected to a shift in the sourcing of commodities. We're seeing a shift away from coal, for example, towards other types of energy supplies. But there are obviously a lot of geopolitical influences, looking just at the current shift away from coal in Russia towards more imports from Colombia again at the moment, as well as technological shifts that are pretty unpredictable in many ways, how they will influence the future demand for minerals. There are various scenarios that are being made, which all point to a very significant increase in demand for several of these minerals, as can be seen here looking at transport, especially the move towards electrical cars, as well as power generation, where the resource need is much, much higher than it is for conventional fossil fuels. Yeah, this is this shows two scenarios. I think it's very telling. The steps scenario that the IEA is quoting is a very low-level scenario that will not allow to reach the Paris Agreement and still requires a very significant, about a doubling in mineral demand, and a more ambitious scenario, the SDS, which would almost allow to reach the Paris commitments, will mean that there's a quadrupling in demand for minerals, with all the consequences that are attached to it. Obviously, as I mentioned, the trajectories for this demand are subject to large technological and as well as policy uncertainties. There will be innovation for sure, as there has been in the past, which may reduce or increase the demand for certain minerals. There will likely be increased recycling capacities and capabilities, but the expectation at the moment is not that this will eliminate the need for new supplies to be included. And well, as was discussed already, mining and processing of minerals comes with links to countries that have weaker labor and environmental protections, and all the risks connected to that. So the supply chains that we are looking at are copper, lead, molybdenum, silver, tin, and zinc from Peru and Bolivia. Both countries play, especially Peru, Bolivia to a lesser degree, play an important role in mine production, as well as in holding very important reserves and being among the top exporters of these minerals, which are playing crucial roles in solar, wind, as well as electric vehicle production. So yeah, what we're seeing is yes, a very important role for mining output from these countries, combined with a complete lack of transparency. We try to make connections along the supply chain, which is obviously very complicated, as we saw in previous presentations. But yeah, there is a big lack in detailed information that would allow to to trace the supply from certain production sites to end products, which is undoubtedly very challenging in multi-tier commodity supply chains. But at the same time, we all know how important monitoring and transparency is in identifying and mitigating risks. And when talking about risks, I would like to hand over to my colleague Diana, who's going to talk about findings on policies and labor rights.
Yes, thank you, Barbara. If you go, yes. So we were looking at the upstream segment of the supply chain, where we will also look at the downstream segment, but I'm not going to present this now. Well, we were looking at 10 companies that are active, as Barbara said, in Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia, and their parent companies in other countries such as Canada, Switzerland, Peru, Brazil, Singapore, and the USA. And we looked at their published human rights policies, and we compared these policies with their sustainability reports just to see if there was alignment between their stated intentions and their actions. And we also run these policies against the 6 steps, the OECD guidelines, basically, to see if indeed they were complying with this. So we found that 2 of the 6 parent companies that had published a human rights policy, there is it's not a big number, it's only 2 of them, whereas all the other companies only have they have a CSR policy that it's more generally speaking about their intentions, but none of them really states how they're actually taking steps to prevent and mitigate human right breaches, especially with regards to labor rights abuses. We also found that all companies provide a channel to file complaints, and this could suggest that there is a grievance mechanism in place, but none of the companies really provided information regarding how grievance investigations take place and how especially remedies provided. And we also didn't find any grievance lists in any of the companies we researched, and basically no detailed information whatsoever. So yeah, this information, as I said, was not part of these HR policies, these human rights policies, and and did not align with their stated sustainability approach. The next, please. The next paragraph, please. In terms of the practices, well, the results we obtained so far are consistent with the results of the Business of Human Rights Research Center, especially in regards to their transition minerals tracker, where almost half of the companies that they researched in 2021 in Latin America had no policies in place. So it seems like this is a common industry practice. But if we take a closer look at the labor rights safeguards for the companies that we researched, the panorama is even more murky. And indeed, the companies that address labor rights as part of their policies mention emphasis on the core labor standards, but they didn't specify again how labor rights risks especially are identified, prevented, and mitigated. And also largely absent from these policies were the core labor issues such as social dialogue and social protection. Also, there was no specification as regarding their hiring practices, and this is especially important in terms of hiring subcontractors, because, well, from a study that was previously conducted by CNV, it seems like this is a particular problem, especially in Colombia and in Peru. You can go to the next, please. So we also looked at the financiers of these companies, and we found that between 2016 and 2021, there were almost $35 million invested in the parent companies or in the local operations in these Latin American countries. And well, amongst the investors and our companies, our banks and European banks and even Dutch pension funds.
Thank you. Thank you, Gianna. Can we stop here? I think the research is very interesting because it shows on one side also what is happening in the transition to the energy sourcing, what the response to it is in theory, but we also have the practice. And I think that the last slide was on the financing, and we haven't yet heard from you whether they take into consideration the policies and the practice on human rights due diligence. But I think that I would like only have a 30-second response, if one of you can respond. Maybe Barbara, you can. How can government and companies and trade unions and NGOs prepare themselves to ensure that the risks that you have identified can be mitigated in our actions? What do we have to do to ensure that it is included?
Diana, do you want to respond?
Yes, certainly. Well, as Barbara mentioned before, transparency is quite an issue. At least we have encountered that, and I think.
Can you speak up a little bit, Diana, because the voice is a bit low?
Yes, certainly improving transparency is a must. So far, it's really hard to keep track of what companies are doing on the ground, but also how companies downstream are taking into account human rights risks in their purchasing decisions. And certainly this should be accompanied by policies that are more binding, legal frameworks that are binding. It's very good that there are voluntary initiatives. Those are very good, but it's proven over again, not just in this sector, but in many other sectors that these are insufficient.
Let's keep it like that. I think it's very in the transparency and binding legal framework should be part of it. Thank you for that. Then I would like to go to the last presenter. That is Mark van der Waal from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. Mark is a senior ecologist, and he will give us some view of the transition in sourcing and environmental impacts of increased mining. Mark, I think you have to talk very fast to keep up with the time.
Yes, I will talk very fast. No
or
worries,
you leave
no
out
worries.
some slides so that
okay.
you can come to the conclusion that you would like to have, and later on we can share the full presentation.
I can do it very quickly.
I give you the go.
Thank you. Just share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay, well, I think when we talk about mining, energy transition, and biodiversity, what we all care about is what's the bottom line, what is below the bottom line. Is that positive or negative? We already know that, of course, that there's a clear link between mines and a lot of high biodiversity areas, like a lot of forests. A report was out in 1999. In 2011, UNESCO brought out a report that a large percentage of our World Heritage sites are being threatened by the mining sector, negatively impacted by the sector. This is a 2020 image of a nickel mining area in Sulawesi, where currently there is a boom in nickel mining for the energy transition specifically. Also, Tesla had a look at it. When we look at these images, then you have to ask, you can see here the forest or the ex-forest and the mine. So we've got to keep this in mind when we think about energy transition and mining for the transition minerals. Often this takes place in forested areas. Mining is one land use option. You can see on the right-hand picture, you can see the consequences of ill-guided mining, what consequences this may have on another sector, like for here, coastal fisheries. So what we see over the last 10, 15 years is an global increase in competing claims between the mining sector, the extractive sector, and the global protected area system and the global indigenous peoples' lands areas. And this conflict is getting bigger and bigger. as we speak. We are talking about an increase in illegal mining, in legal mining, in semi-legal mining, in industrial mining, in small-scale mining, in artisanal mining. And of course, when we talk about industrial mining, when you talk about due diligence, one of the issues that needs to be in place is a proper environmental impact assessment. In most of the contracts that we see in developing economies, these are just rubber stamp procedures and do not function as a management tool at all. Other speakers have mentioned it before, massive increase in mining activities for the transition minerals. 40%, the World Bank 2019 report, 40% of all operational mines lie in forested areas. And we need those forests also for our climate adaptation and mitigation. So coming to the conclusion, what we can do, what we feel as a global conservation union that needs to be done, is that we need to mobilize more state and private actors to subscribe to and implement forward-looking performance standards such as the IRMA. What we also need is, and other speakers have also mentioned it, that we need a public eye. We need eyes on the ground that watch over public interest in the very long term. So we need the eyes and ears of the people that live in the production areas. So we need to involve structurally civil society, the labor unions, the universities in due diligence research and participatory monitoring of mine sites, and not only mine site, but also the associated infrastructures. Because the mines usually, the mining companies usually tend to focus on their legal mine footprint, while the infrastructure that is needed usually has a lot of impact on the landscape and on the connectivity within the landscape. The other sort of structural thing that I think we all need to think about is that we need to move away from talking about mining governance or sustainable mining, because there is no such thing as sustainable mining. You mine something and at one point in time, you're left with a hole. So maybe you can do it responsibly, but I think we should shift that discussion from talking about mining governance to governance of our mineral resource base. So looking from a host country perspective, from a producing country's perspective, look at the mineral resources that we have in our soils, in your soils, and how we can best make use of these minerals for the well-being of the society at large. And then the last point, I think, is that we should enhance, and meaning also the governments that we work with and the financial institutions that we work with, is that we should dramatically enhance public access to the environmental impact assessments, which are in most countries legal documents that should be in the public domain. This was it. A last picture is an endemic bird from the nickel mining area in South Sulawesi, endemic and highly endangered. And this is the thing that we tend to lose if we don't do it carefully, our mines.
Thank you very much, Mark. It was very clear and you did it very fast. So thank you for that. So it will allow us some time to have another discussion with our panelists, whom I would like to introduce right now.
Pauline, sorry to interrupt. Could we, because Mark still has a few minutes left, a question we prepared for Mark, could we ask that?
Sure. Let me see what Mark, Mark, what is the first thing multi-stakeholder agreements like our own in the metals agreement should do to make sure we are prepared for a just energy transition in the mining sector?
Other speakers have mentioned it already. I think it all starts with transparency in the value chain. That is one aspect. So I think we need to push for, because it's very difficult to say anything about responsible mining if we do not know the source of the minerals or the source of the product. And the other thing that other speakers have also mentioned, I think, is that we should enhance tripartite monitoring, civil society, state, and company, doing that joint monitoring to make sure that it's not the company that is monitoring their own performance.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that response. Then I'm now allowed to go to our panelists, because we have an extra number of people who will answer some questions. We have Samantha Smith of the Just Transition Center of the International Trade Union Center. Samantha, welcome. And we have our own chair of the Metals Agreement, Tineke Lamboy. Sorry, Tineke, I just had a blackout. I know you very well. Tineke, welcome from Indonesia, where you are. And I have Mark, I think, on the panel as well. Did I miss somebody?
Orlando from Colombia.
Yes, Orlando, where are you? Orlando, you are from Colombia. Thank you very much for being here with us. You are from Sinta Carbon, the trade union. And that's very interesting, because I think you are very close to the upstream work where things happen on the ground. And as a trade union leader from Colombia, in a coal mine, in times of increased demand of coal, what are the priorities for the workers in the supply chain to guarantee a just transition? Can you give us some clues?
Buenas a todos. Las prioridades.
Hello to everybody. Well, the priorities for the unions in Colombia are as follows. The priorities are always the same. It's important to have a collective bargaining agreement to do our union work. And of course, the safety topic is very important. And if there is a higher demand, then I would like to say, well, we never looked at the volume of the demand. For us, it's important to maintain our rights. And we are very worried now because we have 4 or 5 hours to rest, and that is a high risk because we don't have enough rest time. This can lead to death. And now we're working together with CNV International. CNV International gathered us in a group of workers. So we are working now with the workers and with the government in order to obtain a tripartite dialogue. So we want to oblige the government to look at the transition, and everything that happens in this transition must be subject to a dialogue, because until now we are ignored.
Thank you very much for your answer, Orlando. Indeed, there's a lot of work to be done. Maybe when we have time, I will ask you another question about the legal frameworks. But let me first go to Tineke. Tineke, you are the chair of the Irbc Metals Agreement. And I would like to ask you how you see it that a voluntary initiative like the Irbc agreement contribute to a just transition. What is the key?
Dear Pauline?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Thank you for, yes, thank you.
Because I would like to know what is the key takeaway from today's event, what you have heard that we can include in our agreement's work.
Yeah. Well, as to how a voluntary initiative like the Metals Agreement can contribute to a just energy transition, I would like to share two thoughts. The first one is that a change in the behavior of companies, governments, organizations, and people will only happen if people wish to see that change. So the mental mindset of people is crucial. And whatever role you play in society, if you really want to change something, you have to be that change, and you will, and then you can make it happen. And now this voluntary initiative, it helps people to find like-minded people with whom they can explore this new road and way to do things. So it's more fun and also more effective to do it together. And now companies can also work together in developing new corporate strategies, due diligence tools, and the implementation thereof. Next is that the unions and the NGOs, so the societal parties of the partners of the agreement, contribute to this process by sharing their knowledge about human rights, labor, and environmental issues. So they've gathered so much knowledge on the ground from their partners and with partners doing research in all those countries. So they have the experience in implementing due diligence, and they can assist individual companies in the process and also in projects to walk on that new road. And my second thought is that the best practices which are being developed in this agreement are, in my view as a lawyer, norm setting. So norm setting for responsible business conduct in the whole sector, not only for the parties to the agreement. And these norms are, in my view, legitimized due to a great variety of all agreement participants and their constituencies, because there are companies, societal parties, but also trade federations and governmental stakeholders who participate. And those new norms will fill in and specify the current open norms in the law, and also the open norms in the OECD guidelines, and in other semi-legal frameworks. And ultimately, courts and also national contact points will look for common standards in industries when they are confronted with questions about RBC. So then they will look at the best practices and the lessons learned from our metals agreement, for instance. So my takeaway of today is the changes that are required for the energy transitions are really challenging for all individual parties. So sharing knowledge and enthusiasm is very important. And that is what we see today. And it's key for the realization of the change and for keeping a level playing field in the sector. Thank you, Pauline.
Thank you, Tineke. It's very relevant indeed. Then I would like to ask Samantha a question. You are working for the Just Transition Center, and I would like you to give us an idea of what you think is the role of the social dialogue in just transition, and what must multi-stakeholder initiatives like the Irbc Metals Agreement do to support this social dialogue?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. And just to say where I work for the International Trade Union Confederation, which represents 200 million organized workers in 162 countries. And the Just Transition Center is a union center that supports unions in getting good agreements on just transition. So two quick things. Renee mentioned the agreement that was signed at the climate negotiations in Glasgow about delivering a just transition internationally. And that agreement requires those who signed it to deliver a just transition according to the UN guidelines on just transition negotiated in the International Labour Organization. And under those guidelines, there are really two parts to just transition. The biggest part is social dialogue. And that always involves workers and our representatives, that would be unions, employers, and governments. It is a specific kind of process that usually leads to a binding outcome. For example, if you have social dialogue between employers and unions, that usually is ending up in a collective bargaining agreement. So So it's very important to keep a distinction between this social dialogue, which is one kind of process, and what is being described here, which is another part of just transition, a multi-stakeholder consultation. Multi-stakeholder consultations can be good. They can produce consensus, but they generally don't produce binding outcomes. And I think one of the things that we've heard today is that workers in Colombia and Peru in the mining and metals sector, they need binding outcomes. So the most effective thing the multi-stakeholder process can do to support social dialogue is, first of all, to recognize that this is not a forum. It is a forum where the rights of workers are discussed, but that those rights need to be recognized in a binding way by the government. We heard from Orlando that the Central Carbon is trying to get a tripartite process with the government. They're not getting very far. We hear that workers are getting injured and put at risk of accidents because they're not getting the breaks they need. They're working death shifts. So those are things that you can bring up in the multi-stakeholder process, but they need a binding outcome so that we as workers get our rights. So the more the multi-stakeholder process recognizes those rights and pushes for them in these binding outcomes, the better.
Thank you, Samantha, for this very clear response. Now, before we end, I have an open question that I will ask several of you, because we have listened to today's presentations and comments. And I would like to some of you, what will be the first thing that you will do tomorrow when you wake up as a next step in your own organization to enable the just transition? And I happen to have this morning, I tell you, I walked with this bag. I don't know, do you see it you don't see it clearly, but I will read it. It says, the future depends on what you do today. So it is a statement from Gandhi, a long time ago, but it's still very valid. So all that we have heard today, what can we do as an individual, as part in our network and our work? And I will ask Mark, are you there still with us? I had wanted to ask you, and otherwise, no, let me ask Sabine. Sabine, you are here. I see you. What would you do as a first thing tomorrow from your position to help us?
Thanks a lot, Pauline. And first of all, thanks to all participants. I've learned a lot today. And I think the first thing that I will do when I open my laptop tomorrow is to share these learnings with all relevant colleagues working in this field, because there's work to do. To make it a bit more specific, I think this afternoon we reflected in particular on the importance of multi-stakeholder collaboration. Social dialogue was rightfully mentioned, and responsible business conduct, due diligence in supply chains. And yeah, it's clear that more needs to be done to advance the just transition and make responsible business conduct the norm. In terms of concrete next steps for the Dutch government, because I work for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in this area, we support legislation on responsible business conduct at EU level. This would contribute to a level playing field for companies in the European single market and a larger collective impact in producer countries. We will introduce national Irbc legislation that promotes a level playing field and is in line with the implementation of possible EU legislation. And then on top of legislation, we're implementing a smart mix of mutually reinforcing measures to promote responsible business conduct. This includes, for example, financial incentives, the facilitation of sector-wide cooperation, very important as we heard today, and the Responsible Business Conduct Support Office for companies.
Thank you.
To conclude, we're taking these extra steps to ensure that companies avoid and address negative impacts of their operations and maximize their contribution to sustainable development and the just transition. And yeah, to conclude, I think it's fantastic that we can build on the learnings from the research and multi-stakeholder initiatives, such as the metals agreement that was presented today. So thanks a lot to all of you.
Thank you. So we take you for that, and we'll call on you, especially the binding regulations. That would be great. Then I would like to ask, because we have a few more minutes. I know, Chantal, are you still available? Because I would like to ask you the same question, since you are from the business, the corporate. Can you answer me the question, you know, what would be the first thing that you would do tomorrow to help us in realizing what we have stated here as our priorities?
Yeah, actually, also in line with Sabine, I think it's really important to inform my colleagues. They are, of course, aware, but we have within Tata Steel many sourcing managers, and they reach out to all of our suppliers. Of course, corporate social responsibility is a part of their conversation, but I think it's important to have like more knowledge about what is happening in the world, and also about these presentations. I think it's really important to share this so that they can actually see what's happening and what are the results of what's happening in the mining field. So that's the first thing I will do. And also our South Africa mission is, I think, an important example internally of what we can do. Of course, we have to see what we can do there, but I feel that this is an important first step, and also my colleagues will follow soon, I'm sure.
Thank you, Chantal. I think I have to wrap up what we have heard today, this afternoon.
Actually, not, we can continue. Sorry, Pauline, to interrupt you, but we have informed the participants that we're running a bit out. So if okay with the panel, we would like to give everyone the floor to respond to this final question.
That is great. I hope that the participants are still with us because I cannot see them. And then, of course, before I run off, because on the whole discussion, I can ask Mark the same question. What would be the first thing you would do tomorrow, bearing in mind what we have heard today?
If it wasn't Liberation Day, I would do a lot of things tomorrow. But now what I would do is, in fact, I would look up the Just Transition Center, because I have not heard of them. And you may have noticed that in the mission, in my first slide, the mission, the global mission of IUCN is a just world that protects and conserves nature. So it's, what do we mean with the word just, and how do we so just? I think that's the key to a lot of things, because when we talk about the UN guiding principles, one of the principles is the right to a clean and safe environment. How are we going to organize that?
Thank you.
Thank you.
You will network and make sure that others, you combine efforts. That's a very good thing. Perhaps I can ask Orlando Coelho. Maybe the translator can translate it for him into Spanish. Based on what he has heard today, Orlando, what would be the first thing you would take on from our discussions today as a takeaway that you would like to make an effort to do?
Primero escuchar muchas organizaciones.
Well, many organizations and many persons work in line with what is fair. We're talking about the communities here, about the people, and that is very important. Secondly, I would like to say that as a union organization, we represent the workers, and for us, solidarity is very important. We want to have justice, and that is very important. We are there as a union organization, and we will continue with our work with CNV. We are following a road where we gather also with the government, and that is not easy, but we try to come together with the government in order to have this fair transition in circumstances where we also respect the environment.
Thank you, Orlando. Indeed, meeting up with the government to get a dialogue going. That's very good. Let me then go to Samantha before I reach out to Tineke. Samantha, what would you, based on what we have heard, what we have discussed, do you have a lead about what you say, okay, based on this is what I can do tomorrow that I have gathered from today's discussion?
Two things. So one is to push even harder for a binding European human rights due diligence regulation. And the other is to reach out again to our Colombian affiliate, CUT Colombia, tell them about some of the results from this webinar.
Thank you. Then Tineke, you will be my final vocal point to say what you will do based on the discussion.
Thank you, Pauline. Well, first I would like to thank CMV and you as chair and all participants for the organization and participation of this webinar. I think it has been really, really rich in information and learning process. What I will do tomorrow is I will ask the SER, Socioeconomic Council Secretariat, to follow up and to contact those participants of today who wish to learn more about our metals agreement. So a question to the participants, please submit your contact details with the organization so that we can contact you and can follow up. And another thing I can do tomorrow and also the next 3 weeks that I will be working in Indonesia is I took a screenshot of Mark's slide Sulawesi. And I know this because I've been working on mining issues before in Indonesia with my colleagues at the university in Surabaya. And for the next 2 weeks, I will also do joint research with them, also on mining issues and also on legal frameworks like international trade and investment agreements that sometimes are making it more difficult for governments to implement and monitor the higher environmental and social standards on the ground. To end, I would really encourage the participants to join our metals agreement. It's a great collaboration that is currently taking place. And yeah, the more companies also, the more leverage we can create for a just energy transition. So to really be the change in international supply chains. And it will help us and the parties also to learn from other parties' mistakes and best practices. So please join our agreement or ask for more information. And thanks again to the organization.
Thank you, Tineke. You said a lot of things are very good and many things to be done. I think this discussion was indeed rich. And what we have gathered from in the end is that what it shows us, we need more transparency. We need more participatory monitoring. We need a social dialogue. And we need to involve the governments to make sure that the rules are binding and they are applied. And I think that by working together, we can do more. And what we have seen is that as an individual, we cannot do much, but whatever action we take now has an impact on our future. So let's work on it together, because sharing is caring. And that is what we want with the just transition, because the transition is happening one way or the other. So let's try to make it move in the right direction for everybody here and there. So I thank you all for being here with us. We sent you a recording within a week's time. We will use parts of our presentations for our social media because we want to entice and inform other people who have not been with us today. But all of you who were with us, thank you very much.